A few weeks ago, my daughter Alexia was throwing things in a suitcase. She had decided very last minute, about 3 hours before the plane's departure, to fly standby and visit my sister in North Carolina. Alexia's boyfriend had given her an airline pass, and it struck her as a good time to go for a visit. She yearned to crawl on the floor with my sister's 2 little boys, ages 3 and 2. Now, with no time to stop and buy gifts for them, Alexia had the good sense to recycle a couple of gently used toys. She gave them a second life. She had a big stuffed Batman doll and a little toy fabric dinosaur that she had loved once upon a time. Zipped into the suitcase, off they went to North Carolina. The morning of her arrival, Alexia reached into her bag, and the boys were just so tickled with the gifts she had brought them. Glenn, who is 3 years old, immediately abandoned his former favorite toy and latched onto that Batman doll. Matter of fact, I talked to my sister last week in preparation for this sermon, and she said that Batman doll is still Glenn's most cherished plaything. Now, Glenn is really little, and so his parents have not let him see superhero movies. But when my sister's family has the TV on, it's pretty much a steady diet of Sesame Street and the Muppets. But stories of superheroes like Batman are all around Glenn. They're heard on the playground at his Montessori school, made visual on T-shirts and costumes, and spoken by the little kids that he hangs out with. As she told me about my sister's kids' reaction to the gifts, my daughter Alexia said, "You know, Mom, one reason I think Batman is so well loved is that he hasn't been bitten by any toxic spider. And he doesn't have a kryptonite backstory. He's just a regular human being. And a regular human being who has faced tragedy and heartache. The Batman story is so well loved because Bruce Wayne, the person inside that bat suit, is supposed to be like you and me, doing marvelous things in service to humanity." Now, you may wonder why I am telling you this story, but I promise I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. What I'm here to talk about today is salvation. Now, I promise I'm not going to rain down fire and brimstone on your heads. But I do wonder about if you've thought about salvation and what it means to you. I imagine some of you in the sanctuary have an adverse reaction to the word, as it takes you back to some time when someone told you that the only way to a good life was to accept the Christian teaching that Jesus died for our sins. Perhaps the word salvation brings to mind the angry and misguided folks of the Westboro Baptist Church picketing at a funeral for someone they have deemed to be hellbound. Or maybe it's the apocalyptic visions of a post-rapture world that appear in books, like the Left Behind series. Or maybe it's that guy with the big rainbow wig at football games who holds up that sign that says John 3:16. If these are the kind of things that come to mind for you, I can see why the idea of salvation doesn't get a lot of airtime in UU world. These images may not be common in UU settings, but I do think we need to talk about the core theological concepts in our congregations, and salvation is one of them. The Christian notion of salvation is an idea that has saved lives. It's given folks meaning when life was just too painful to take. I love the complex, meaningful, and loving theologies that give a larger frame of understanding to so many, to people I admire. My favorite author is Anne Lamott. Her voice is witty and wise, and her stories quite often spring from her Christian faith. Lamott's spiritual sincerity speaks to my heart. And the life and teachings of Jesus are inspiring to me. And I want our UU community to be a place where all who search for truth are welcome, not only those who flatly rejected the divinity of Jesus. The concept of salvation is not foreign to our tradition. It's been spoken of by our preachers stretching back through time. Both Unitarians and Universalists have preached and written extensively on what theologians call the doctrine of substitutionary atonement. The idea that God is made human in Jesus in order to die on the cross and pay the penalty for humanity's sins. But let's start by going back in time. I think it's going to be an oversimplified whirlwind trip through Christian history, so forgive me for the blurry scenery as it goes past. The early Christian church was a movement filled with longing and a search for hope for a better world. The Gospels tell about a Jesus who cared for the sick, taught lessons in parables and stories, and preached about the meek and the merciful. For nearly 1,000 years, the stories of Jesus rippled through history, taking on new shapes as they were expressed through art and theology and philosophy. But in the 11th century, a time of great political unrest and social unrest in Europe, Pope Urban II reversed an almost 1,000-year-long teaching about the sin of shedding human blood by urging people to go forth on a crusade to the Holy Land. Understanding that a common enemy could galvanize European Christians, Pope Urban announced that sins of any shape or size, past, present, or future, could be forgiven if the elect were to go on a crusade against the infidels, the unfaithful. Inflicting suffering and violence went from being a sin to an act of redemption. In the 14th and 15th centuries in Europe was again a very bleak time, and half of the population of Europe died due to wars, epidemics, and disasters. A collective sense of having done something to deserve the misery that surrounded them brought heartache to many. People searched for ways to atone, to make up what they thought were their perceived sins, seeing suffering as something that was purchasing believers a place in the afterlife. The Protestant Reformation that began in the 16th century brought another shift to people's views. The Protestant Puritans, who began white settlement in what became New England, were very binary in their thinking, dividing life into good and evil, sacred and profane, salvation or sin, elect or damned. The Puritans and early colonists held the view that suffering was a sign of favor by God. God cared so much for the Puritans that God strengthened them by heaping pain on their heads. Seeing suffering as something edifying became the dominant way of understanding that pain. This is heavy stuff. And here is where our Unitarian and our Universalist ancestors come into the dialogue. Hosea Ballou traveled this country on horseback, preaching his Universalist gospel to anyone who would listen. In 1805, Ballou published his great work, A Treatise on Atonement, in which he makes a case for a loving God, a God who loves so much that he could never place somebody in eternal damnation. And just about 10 years later, in 1819, Unitarian William Ellery Channing preached what is perhaps his most famous sermon, Unitarian Christianity, in which he said, "We reject as unscriptural the explanation given by the popular system, the manner in which Christ's death procures forgiveness for men." Channing desired to show Jesus to be a figure worth emulating, not an otherworldly being far removed from human empathy and experience. William Ellery Channing urged Unitarians to learn from Jesus' example. Mirroring the words of Paul, we read together this morning, and Channing said, "If I were called to give you one rule, it would be this: live a life of faith and hope. Believe in the mighty power of truth and love." The UU ancestor who helped further shape a reimagined concept of salvation was Universalist Clarence Skinner. Skinner wrote his great work on the topic, The Social Implications of Universalism, in 1915, in which he presented a universalist idea of God, a God he called a universal spirit whose nature is love. Skinner had come to believe that in an avenging God, along with the concept of substitutional atonement as the means to salvation, kept the faithful too narrowly focused on the individual. If we spend our days counting our credits towards heaven, we are not living in the here and now. The individualist focus creates a blindness to how truly interconnected life is. That focus leads a person to miss out on the real meaning of life, that love and care is what it's all about in this life. That's where salvation rests. Now here's where the Batman story figures in. We all love stories of heroes and mighty salvific figures. My nephew Glenn, only 3 years old, can already grasp the idea that mortal life can be a pretty rough ride, that you've got to hold tightly to whatever little twinkle of hope and love and light you can find. For him, it's his favorite new Batman doll, his family, and his preschool community. It makes me realize that the best kinds of heroes are the people who walk with us through the shadowy passages, who love us, who hold our hands when the going gets rough. Our salvation comes through those interwoven threads of love and service. I'll give you an example of the saving power of love and service from our Unitarian history, the story of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was born in Maine in 1802 to a not-so-happy family. Her father was a distributor of religious tracts, and that those tracts promoted a vision of hellfire and brimstone theology, and her family continually moved from place to place. Dix often felt neglected and abused, and so at age 12, she ran away. Sometimes she lived with an aunt, sometimes with her grandmother, and sometimes alone. A precocious and intelligent person, Dix opened her own private school when she was only 14 years old. She believed that the work of a teacher must include community service, and so she ran a free evening school for poor children, one of the first in our nation. Her family had been Methodist. Her grandmother brought her to the Congregationalist church, but none suited her until Dix finally found a home in the Unitarian church. She was drawn by the message of the goodness of God and the sense of shared responsibility to care for all of society. She heard the good news of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. Love is the doctrine of this church, and service is its prayer. Dorothea Dix became a close friend of Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, establishing an extensive network of friends in the Boston Unitarian community. Though Dix struggled her whole life with emotional lows and feelings of loneliness and alienation, she had a tight network of Unitarian friends. Her community gave her love and helped her to see her own inherent worth and dignity. With the supportive love of that faith community, she was emboldened to take that love out into the world through service to others. It happened by chance. A ministerial student, frustrated with his efforts to teach a Sunday class to women incarcerated in the local jail, approached Dix for advice. After hearing the ministerial student's concerns about working with women, Dix agreed to teach the Sunday school class herself. And what she encountered in that prison shocked her, and it changed her life. The jail was unheated, and the incarcerated were all mixed together. Everyone from violent offenders to children with intellectual disabilities and adults with profound mental illness were all held in the same small, unheated, and derelict space. Dix secured a court order to have the prison provide heat and make urgent improvements. In providing love and service to those in her community, she began to wonder about the conditions of other facilities in Massachusetts and beyond. Dix educated herself on the latest research on the best kind of care for people with emotional and mental disease. She personally visited facilities throughout the country in an era when women did not travel on their own, and an era when women were not institutional reformers. When Dix traveled to Rome for much-needed rest, she could not resist looking on the conditions of the Italian institutions. And she was shocked by what she found there, too. The conditions, again, were deplorable. So what did she do? She got an audience with the Pope. And Pope Pius IX agreed to right the wrongs that she had identified and praised her service to humanity, likening her to a saint. Dorothea Dix, Unitarian hero. She was an everyday woman who was loved, and that love was made visible by service to her fellow beings. To paraphrase Cornel West, service is what love looks like in public. Dix knew her salvation was wrapped up with mine. As Unitarian Universalists, we must resist falling into the trap of thinking that we can make it on our own, that we have all the answers. Dorothea Dix ran away from the loneliness of her childhood home, ran away from the punitive theological message she'd heard as a young person. She found a liberating, life-affirming love in her Unitarian church community, and that gave her her superpowers. Universalist theologian Clarence Skinner put it this way: "It has not only been true in the past, but it is true today, that those who believe in an avenging God and a substitutionally atoning Christ are focused too narrowly on the individual. The old theology of heaven and hell has been among the strongest deterrents to social service and the reorganization of religious forces for compassionate action. Just as Dix did, we must reject that every man for himself kind of salvation and seek a different path, a path that acknowledges our interdependent lives. We need the power of our collective vision so we don't get mired in individualistic muck. And that holds us back if we do that, and leaves us lonely and hidden from connection. We need to take the love and connection we find here, outside these walls, out into the wider world. There is room for us to have a UU understanding of what it means to be saved, a reimagined kind of salvation, which holds on to those aspects of those Christian themes and then reimagines them for today. Right here, right now, we are connected to a place where we may find love, honor, affirmation, freedom and commitment, and salvation. We understand salvation not as an entry pass to another world at death, but as a recognition that right here and right now, we have the opportunity to be more than we currently are, to find the path to wholeness through love and service. May it be so.